So it's a great pleasure to welcome Anand Pandian to the multi-species coronavirus reading group. We've got three fantastic pieces that have come out during the pandemic. It was a lovely surprise as they started to emerge as not only the interesting sort of content that is explored in these pieces, but also the form. I think it's really exemplary of what an anthropologist can do to engage with broader publics rather than just kind of speak within the discipline. So we have three pieces on the table: Staying at Home on Planet Earth, What I Learned from an Unlikely Friendship with an Anti-Masker, and Look Around You, The Way We Live Explains Why We Are Increasingly Polarized. And I thought I'd just dive in and ask about the second one, which was kind of in the middle of the pandemic. It focuses on a guy named Frank, an anti-masker, someone who participated in the January 6th gathering, although it sounds like he didn't storm the Capitol. So maybe if you could just give us an update about Frank, tell us kind of about where he is at now, and also give us a sense of where he's from. You talk about the challenge as an anthropologist of trying to kind of understand the values and get past the rhetoric to really understand the situated lives of people. And he's in this piece saying some things that would be inflammatory in many circles that we run in. But what does freedom mean for something like Frank? And how does his life look like now that the immediate crisis of vaccines and masks has kind of been dealt with and normalized?
Yeah, thank you so much, Evan, for the introduction, to you and to Rachel for the kind invitation, to Frederic and others who joined in. I've admired what you've all been doing with the coronavirus reading group. It's terrific that you've maintained this conversation for so long through the unending pandemic that we find ourselves in, and it really is an honor and a pleasure to join you, given all the important things that you and others have had to say about the topic in this conversation. These particular pieces, I didn't necessarily intend to write them as a set. I didn't even intend, when I reached out to, say, outlets like The Guardian to write about this topic in particular. They kind of grew out of exchanges that have had to do for me with trying to kind of find a footing or a landing point for this work that I've been doing here in the United States since the 2016 election, and trying really to make sense, as Evan knows, because we were on a panel together shortly after that election, just trying to make sense of where we seem to be in this country, and the sense suddenly that so many people shared in late 2016 of certain impasses or insuperable divides or disjunctures that seem suddenly to so obviously organize contemporary life in the United States, and the question of what to do with them, what to do with that evidence, and more specifically, what to do against them, or what to do in terms of building a better foundation for progressive political movement and organizing in support of difference, in support of the right of others and the place of others in a society as complex and interconnected as ours in the United States, but also more generally in the world at large. And it was a desire to kind of make sense of that led me to begin to completely scrap what I had in mind with regard to the sabbatical that I had lined up for 2017. I scrapped the project altogether, and decided actually to just start traveling around the country and to try to make sense, in particular, more than anything else, of the I mean, the starting point really for me more than anything else was the border wall. the tremendous force of this particular slogan, "Build the Wall," this hashtag, that that in many ways, more than anything else, I would say, propelled our previous president into the White House. And the puzzle of why this particular fantasy, and this symbol really of a certain kind of politics would have the kind of power it did, and enough, in fact, to bring this level of power and authority to business tycoon, and a business tycoon who honestly wasn't necessarily even that great at the business of business, right? So how do we get here? And I began to kind of travel around the country and do all kinds of things. Go to trade shows, uh, um, sort of pick up stories that I read about in the media, and go to these towns that I'd read about, and to try to spend some time there, and to meet people that I've been reading about. Uh, Go to gathering places for other forms of discourse and conversation. And it was at a conference in the summer of 2017 that I met the man that I call Frank in that piece. It was a conference called Freedom Fest, which is a kind of libertarian extravaganza that happens every summer, typically in Las Vegas. The event is billed as the world's largest gathering of free minds, and it, as I came to learn when I went, would sort of draw everyone from sort of rank and file uh, members of the Republican Party, political conservatives, but also libertarians, and people as sort of prominent in the United States as sort of leading figures at Fox News, and leading conservative and libertarian business people. There's a whole sort of contingent with regard to this event that was represented by followers of Ayn Rand and people who'd been inspired by Ayn Rand. And so Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead were in some ways sort of not the, I mean, I don't think the right word to use here is in this context is Bible, but the books that attracted the most fervor and interest of all those who attended these conferences. And this particular individual that I call Frank, kind of, as I say in the piece, wound up sitting next to each other at one of these events, and kind of hit it off, and we're talking, and it was clear that we had nothing in common politically, and in fact had almost nothing to agree on, but we both seemed to like arguing. So we did a lot of that over a few days and seemed to enjoy it. And I made plans to visit him in this small town that he came from in southern Michigan, which I did later that summer, and spent a few days with him there. Continued to be in touch. He actually visited me in Baltimore a few months after that. Walked around my university campus. We had all kinds of debates about campus censorship, all kinds of things that he was very concerned about when it came to American universities. I had to point out that I had Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments sitting on my desk. To talk about how Smith was as much a part of my sort of intellectual coordinates as his, perhaps, right? But maybe a different Smith than the Wealth of Nations. Anyway, we did all that, and we were in touch off and on. But that was way back in 2017, 2018, and I was working on this book meanwhile, and I was realizing, and this was the argument I was developing in those months and over those couple of years. What was an argument along the lines of the following: that to really understand why ideas like the border wall appeal so powerfully in the contemporary United States, we have to stop and take a look at the everyday walls and boundaries that Americans live with and take for granted in their daily lives. Because time and again, what people would do in making sense of the need for a border wall was compare the idea of an unwalled country, of a defenseless country, to the idea of an unwalled home, the idea of a home without a door, the idea of a home without fences or gates or whatever, right? And so it was very clear that many, many people were thinking metaphorically and figuratively between the space of the home and the larger space of the country. And Frank was one of those people. We were sitting on my front porch in Baltimore one afternoon a few summers ago, and we were talking about immigration politics. And then I was obviously much more interested than he was in the idea of meeting people in need with sympathy and kindness. And he reached over from the chair he was sitting on my front porch and wrapped his hand on my front door and asked the question. It comes down to this: how many people do you want in here? Right? How many people do you want in here? Right? For him, these two spaces were entirely analogous: the space of the home and the space of the country. So we talked about those things, and I wrote about those things, and I came up with a manuscript that tried to kind of make sense of this political situation as I found it. Found an agent, luckily, and began to try to sort of find a publisher, and that took us into late 2019, and then the spring of 2018, 2020 came, and, and well, everything was very different. And everything was very different to begin with, and everything slowed down for all of us in all kinds of ways. And that's where, in some ways, that first piece came from, the piece that you mentioned as well, the piece that I published in the Hindu, two springs ago. But in the midst of all that, this particular project ran into a kind of conceptual mental impasse, because here I was making this case, or here I was developing this argument around conservative investments in walls and boundaries and safety and protection, and the need for serious protective measures that would separate those within and those without, and maybe also as a corollary, developing arguments around kind of liberal openness uh, um, to porosity and so on and so forth. And I imagine you're guessing where I'm going here. Suddenly, everything at first seemed to be inverted. Many people commented on this, right? I'm not alone in saying this. Columnists were commenting on this phenomenon in the New York Times. Trevor Noah, as many of you would probably know, did a routine when he was kind of mocking Trump's disinterest in masks before we ever saw Trump wearing a mask, and said, well, he should just understand that a mask is just a border wall for the mouth, right? Why wouldn't that be enough, right? Which is funny, but it also brings into focus the fact that there seemed to be a certain kind of curious inversion when it came to the politics. And this really threw me for a loop at first, right? What was I doing with this project? And for a while, I felt I just set the manuscript aside. I didn't know what to do. Of course, we had young kids. Our home was a mess, like it was everywhere else, and so I didn't really have time to do very much by way of writing than to tweet, kind of regular frustrated basis. But in the midst of all, to be honest, what I was also doing was keeping tabs on people that I'd been in touch with, keeping up correspondence with people that I had been in touch with this project, and certain things came into focus in a very different way. So one thing I realized pretty quickly is that among the many people that I had come to get to know and even befriend from late 2016 onward, many on the right, people had very disparate reactions, right, as we know. But among them were people like Frank, who became quite ardent anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers. And so we began a whole correspondence, a lengthy correspondence about the politics of the pandemic. And we got to a point where we were writing several times a day back and forth to each other. We exchanged hundreds of messages, tens of thousands of words with each other. About the election, about the politics of the election, about whether or not people like us could ever talk at all, about the pandemic, what things were like in Southern Michigan, what things were like in Baltimore, acrimonious exchanges, sometimes reconciliations, all of which I tried in some ways to give some place for in that piece that you brought up, Evan. But this is a long-winded introduction to that piece and to how we got here. But to answer your question as to where he is now, I really have no idea, because that piece in some ways was a chronicling of our falling out. It was a chronicling of how difficult it was for us to actually remain in touch, for how difficult it was for us to sustain a relationship under the circumstances as they developed, as they intensified, as they radicalized the polarities that we see at work, that we saw at work, that we continue to see at work. In many ways, that was a chronicle of a failed relationship, is mediated by the politics of the pandemic. And so what I'm really trying to do at this point is to try to make sense of those impasses. This has become a project really about those impasses and why it is that under these circumstances, it is so difficult, in fact, to find that common ground, to retain that space of communication, why all these calls for empathy and understanding and so on fall flat. And so that perspective around walls continues to be salient, just in different ways.
Thanks, Anna. This is a really rich set of interlocking narratives that you're weaving together, and sticking with this trouble of maintaining the home and the nation is a really an interesting comparison. If anyone else is on here who would like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, or unmute yourself. In absence of that, I've got a follow-up just on the first piece, relating to some of the same things that you were just talking about, and also the presence of frogs in there, which I was delighted to see. Frogs are one of my ethnographic familiars as well. And maybe if you could just say more about here's your early attempt to make sense of the home, before any of us could really anticipate the horror of these long-term isolation projects, especially with kids. And if you could maybe reflect on some of the key words in this piece. One of the subject headings is kinship beyond the family circle. What kinds of kin emerged over the longer part of the lockdowns for you? Also, maybe you mentioned your tweets, and I was following those tweets during the pandemic and found that you were among the most observant in kind of doing the arts of noticing just the detritus of the pandemic. I remember a very early tweet of yours that I think it was either gloves or masks, just like detritus in the street that's now ubiquitous. But it was one of the first times that kind of made you talked about the mouth, border wall, the mask, but all kinds of other boundaries and borders have been enacted. Just an invitation to also comment on the material culture of the pandemic. The plastic that comes out in your second piece, the concrete of the wall, to just think about these attempts to demarcate space to prevent contagion, but within these borders, what kinds of convivial possibilities are there, and what kinds of flourishings happened, but also what kinds of horror did we collectively experience. I think that's all here.
Mm. Thank you for that. And spring is coming here where I live. It's a really warm day today. Everything smells different. There are smells, I think, rising out of the ground, right? With the warmer air. So you can feel it. The crocuses are out. There are buds all around. We're hearing, I've actually, one of the things I started doing we've all got our kind of pandemic fallbacks, like the things that we've learned to do, right? And I walk a lot in the park that we live near, a lot more than I used to, and I've started birding. And so I'm a little more aware of, well, birds, but also bird calls than I was before. And so a lot of the migratory songbirds are coming back, right? It's all beginning to happen. And those toads that I write about in that first piece, they haven't started up yet, but they will, right? We're kind of on the edge of that. So what you're saying takes me back to that in a very tangible way. And I think there is something really, reassuring about that, about that cyclicality, and about even the the faith with which we can conjure up the reliability of such returns when so much feels so fraught and tenuous for so many people. Like, I can't think, for example, like when I speak of migratory songbirds coming back, right, or smells coming back, right, or flowers coming back, I can't think about the hundreds of thousands of people who've had to leave Ukraine over the last 2 weeks, and the basic question about whether how many of them will be able to come back. Right? There's so much about the circumstances as we have them now that locks us into, or locks many people into, directional forms of movement. So returns feel like a luxury in a way that maybe they haven't always, right? And there's something really, I think, kind of powerful and poignant about that. But I really do feel, I mean, like, if we think about migratory critters or people, like if we think about circumstances that put both people and things on the move, if we think about being on the move, not simply in terms of movements of migration and displacement, but also in terms of social movements, even like movements of organizing, right? Movements, efforts to move societies in other directions, as well as, of course, like the movements of the pandemic, like these charts, these graphs, like they go up, they go down, right? There are many different forms of movement that we're tracking side by side right now, and I think that as we think through all of that, we think through what's at stake in this, and what's at stake in particular for questions of sociality and kinship under these circumstances. I really have come to believe that that we are at a certain kind of fork in the road. And maybe this isn't, I don't mean to be too presentist about this. Maybe there's always been a fork in the road. Or maybe it's never a fork. Like maybe we travel along incommensurate paths side by side and never actually notice that there's some other way of going, right? Maybe that's what the election was in 2016, the realization there are people who are walking very different paths than the ones that many of us took for granted as the paths we were on, right? So maybe it isn't truly a fork at all. I don't know. Maybe it's a fiction to even think of it as a fork. But certainly, if we stop for a moment and think about the very question that you posed right now with regard to kinship, with regard to belonging, with regard to who's in and who's out, we have very different visions, right? There are at least two very different, not to be overly binaristic about it, but there are at least two very different visions that I think one can point to side by side. I definitely think that there's a great deal of force and power in a politics predicated on drawing hard lines between inside and out, drawing hard lines between those who belong and those who don't, those we notice and those we don't, those lives that we take seriously and those lives we don't, those things that we take seriously and those things we don't, right? There is an overly binaristic politics that has a great deal of momentum that manifests itself in terms of authoritarian commitment, nationalist xenophobia, a complete disregard for environmental externalities and consequences, a failure to think of kin along the more expanded lines that you've been thinking a lot about and writing about, Frederic, everyone in this community of yours, right? There's a real difficulty, I think, with that more expanded sense of kinship and belonging on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, there have been these openings and they've been real. We've seen some of the largest, I think people talked about the Women's March the Women's Marches of January 2017 as some of the largest social movements that we'd seen in modern times, right? And then came the rallies of June 2020 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, right? Which were probably actually the largest rallies of the modern era, definitely in this country, perhaps beyond. And it isn't just that. It isn't just people coming together for reasons like that. Like, there are all kinds of ways in which people, I think, have really kindled many people have kindled a more expansive sense of solidarity, of belonging, of mutuality, all the interest in mutual aid, which of course extends to human communities, but extends, I think, far beyond them as well, for many people, and has become a really important way of imagining the space of everyday life, of imagining what it is, where it is that one belongs, and with whom one belongs, of imagining those that one shares a life or a place with, and of putting those things into practice in practices as disparate as, just the simple question of the company you keep when you walk, uh, to the design of cities, the design of streetscapes, and the question of the kind of space people will need to put into practice the kind of conviviality that you spoke of, to make a space for it, to make a home for it, even. So I do think that it's been a difficult time, but it's also it's an interesting time. It is a time of emergent possibility. And so one thing that I'm really trying to do, one lesson of the pandemic for me with this book project, is that it isn't enough simply to talk about walls, to talk about the closures, to talk about the desire to kind of step away and lock oneself in. Because side by side with that are all these ways of striking up connections and relations and attachments to the outside, to people and places and beings outside, to even things outside. And I think so much is going to turn in terms of the politics that we care about on the vitality of those more expansive pictures of care, and the extent to which they can actually become part of the lived everyday texture of our lives moving forward.
Thank you. So the floor is again open. I've got more questions. I can monopolize this discussion. Always happy to hear myself talk. And I guess following directly from that, you offer a vivid description of Homestead, Florida, and I guess the most recent piece, where you're talking about these gated communities. It's accompanied by a really vivid picture of welcome for your protection, because we care. Oh, right, Frederic, go ahead. I missed your hand.
No, go ahead, Ben. I'll take the next one.
Okay. So I was just kind of building towards a question about security, kind of juxtaposing these visions of security and the kinds of immunity and community that that is kind of the conditions of life in a pandemic like the one that we just lived through. And also it's a question about different kinds of vulnerability. I sense that Frank felt vulnerable in many kinds of ways, as the economic system that he depended on was no longer predictable. I would imagine, I don't think you explicitly addressed this, but someone like him becoming dependent on government aid was probably a moment that felt very vulnerable to him. So yeah, I guess it's a broad question about how we reckon with these kinds of vulnerabilities, be they personal, policing the body, be they these policing of community boundaries. And yeah, I guess how to do that politics of inclusion. And also, I mean, this is like a series of just like thoughts and, rambling questions here. But also the idea of living with the virus, right? That idiom that came to get picked up by business leaders and politicians in some ways is really similar to the idiom that we'd been thinking with in multi-species studies for a while about, living with plants or living with animals, not just using them as food or mobilizing them as symbols. But of course, there's very little agreement about how to live with the virus. So yeah, that's kind of a lot on the table. So maybe I'll just leave that big mess on the table and invite you to jump in wherever it seems relevant. Oh, you're muted.
I can't help but think about the formal parallel between wrestling with a big mess on the table and and living with vulnerability, right? Like that's exactly what it is. But the question is, how do you make your peace with the mess on the table instead of uh, demanding or necessitating that things remain in their place, uh, because things are out of place. We are out of place, and I think all of the the politics of self sufficiency and autonomy, all the liberal politics of self sufficiency and autonomy that are predicated on the idea of things being in place, of people being in place, of people having a place of their own from which they can comfortably exclude everything else that has no place there, right? All the lines that anchor liberalism, despite its rhetorics of freedom and openness, all of those lines get troubled in wildly distorted ways under these circumstances of intermingling breath. And and so vulnerability is definitely on the table. It's on the table for folks like Frank, who I write about in that piece. But of course, it's on the table for all of us. We could, if the if the if the election was a certain kind of wake up call, say in the United States, we couldn't simply imagine our kind of like citadels uh, of shared radical political commitment or progressive commitment or whatever, our urban citadels. We couldn't imagine them somehow as places apart, right? Like we couldn't imagine creating our own mini republics. That we were in this larger thing that we had to acknowledge. Like our lives were intertwined clearly with those who had very different commitments. All of that became much more tangible when like the question of intertwined lives became, as we know, right, a matter of life and death. So that sense of vulnerability, I think, is one that has very much been on the table in all kinds of ways. Um, but I think, as with any other worldly challenge or existential condition, ethical dilemma, um, how we face such circumstances has everything to do with the tools and resources we have at hand. And I think that communities that have managed these new forms of vulnerability more effectively are communities that have had to reckon with that existential predicament for a very long time, have had to rely on each other because they can't rely on the government. They can't rely on the elites of their countries, right? They can't rely on the kind of support they need. That there are, in fact, collective cultures that are grounded in the insight that vulnerability is, in fact, uh, an almost inescapable concomitant of our lives, and one that is not only sort of a basic predicament, but one whose experience is radically disparate depending on the circumstances in which one lives. So what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? What have you been doing? Some people have been much more prepared, quite frankly, than others. And being prepared isn't simply about stocking up on water and toilet paper, right? There's the kind of existential and ethical preparation that's also been on the table. And I think that when we take that seriously, we see that some people have just been a lot more discomfited than others by that predicament. Um, you used two words side by side, which I thought was brilliant. You said immunity and community, and it reminded me actually of Eula Biss's book. I don't know if she's been part of your conversations at all, but Eula Biss's book on immunity. The subtitle is An Inoculation. It's a brilliant examination through a series of essays of precisely this, of the kind of inescapability of vulnerability that any politics of immunity or immunization countenances, and the fact of community that is therefore implied. That with vulnerability, with the condition of vulnerability, comes the reality of community, the reality that whether I acknowledge it or not, I am with others. And everything turns on how prepared I am to live with that reality.
Thank you. That was a beautiful response. Frederic, go ahead.
Thanks. It's very good to hear you, Anand. Last time I saw you was October 2016, so just before the election. And I had the feeling that America had become very foreign to me. So it's great that you take this post-election America as a field of investigation. And can you come back to the question you raised at the beginning? Why masks are not border walls, and what can we make with this inversion that those who pleaded for building borders didn't want to wear a mask? And the way I see one potential answer is to say that is what you write in the articles about shelters and home, and also all the ethnographic description of the SUV as this new form of car that is very expensive and energy consuming, but that gives you a feeling of protection, not only for you, but also for your family that is inside the car. And so building a border is a sense of the family that is within the territory, whereas wearing a mask is something that you do as a person, and that often follows rules of civil life. You are often told to wear a mask. It's a form of clothes, wearing tissues. It's often been something addressed to women, how they should dress and how they should not dress, whereas building borders and driving car is more male. So I wonder if there is this dimension of I decide who can be inside and outside, because there's something patriarchal, whereas wearing a mask is something more feminine, and precisely coming from the patriarch. I've done some investigation about why people chose to wear a mask or not, and that's one of the ideas that I came up. But I'd be glad to hear you about that.
The investigations that you've been doing have been in France?
Yeah, they were in the suburbs of France, in the area that has been very exposed to COVID-19, and we made some quantitative survey also in Dakar and Taiwan and South Brazil. So it's data that I'm working on for a publication.
And do you feel that there would be sort of a kind of transnational continuity with regard to the reasons why people might be resistant, or the ways in which one could explain it between?
So we wanted to do some investigation in the US, and unfortunately we had a team who was ready to do the research, but there was so much consent form to fill to do the investigation in the US that we were able to do that in several countries, but not in the US. But one question that we raised in all these different sites was, should the president wear a mask? And in all countries, the answer was yes. And we thought that in the US it would be divisive. But yeah, I think the US probably had a specific situation regarding masks. But as you point out, I mean, this kind of inversion where you believe that blocking migrants with a border works, but you don't believe that blocking a virus with a mask works. That's very strange.
Well, I think this is it's a wonderful question, Frederic, and
it's your question actually.
No, it's your question. You asked it. um, and
It's a
I mean, it's something that, but yeah, it's something that I'm thinking around. And you're right. Like it is something that I've been wrestling with. Um, I think one way to, I think one way, there are many ways that one can enter into this, but let's enter into it this way, because you referenced that comparison between the border wall and the mask, right? Which
Mm.
which Trevor Noah had made. Um, let's just keep in mind that in all of those, in so many of those places where conservative Americans have argued about the need for a wall, the politicians have argued for the need for a wall. It hasn't been that the border has been completely open. It's not like you see a kind of windswept plain where there is no line, and that therefore you need a kind of concrete demarcation or a kind of structure in the face of something that is completely and radically open. That's actually not the issue. The issue that people talk about is that you have fences, you have wire, you have things that would appear to be boundaries but aren't effectively boundaries. So those and so the appeal of a concrete wall. And I've not only, I mean, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but I was actually at a concrete trade convention the week that Trump was inaugurated as president in 2017. Actually, I think I write about that in one of these pieces. And I've talked to wall designers. I've talked to wall, like even to people who were pitching border wall designs when that call went out from the Department of Homeland Security. So I'm interested in part in the materiality of the wall as it gained form and, um, and substance. And I think it's just worth thinking about that it wasn't as though you had something that was completely open that then had to be closed in this dramatic fashion. You had something that stood, that sort of looked like a boundary, but wasn't actually a boundary, right? Something that looked like a border, but wasn't actually like a border. Something that looked safe, but wasn't actually safe. And I think that actually matters a great deal. I think that a lot of people who, and I've been spent a lot of time on sort of different social media platforms for anti-masking, for sort of opposition to masks. I mean, I've way too much time, honestly, in a lot of these spaces, and a lot of it actually, and even in conversations that I've had, I think a lot of it comes down to the contention that the mask is actually ineffective. Like a mask looks like it's doing something, but it doesn't actually do anything. Like I think a mask is actually not a barrier for many people. In the same way that a fence is not a barrier for many people. In the same way that barbed wire is not a barrier for many people. In the same way these days that a car isn't adequate protection on the road for many people who will go for that SUV, as you mentioned. In many ways, that a bicycle, right, or a pair of shoes is an adequate defense against the everyday threats of the world, right? There are distinctions that people draw all the time between adequate protection and inadequate protection. And the things that people are forced to rely on that stand or symbolize or even embody forms of inadequate protection, ultimately, I would say, probably attest to the vulnerability of the body. Anyone who walks, one of the people that one of the people that I write about in this manuscript project is a man named Mark Baumer, who was a climate justice activist. He was actually a poet and an environmental activist who lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and decided in 2016 to walk barefoot across the country. And began doing so, found it too cold, began doing so from Providence, found it too cold, went south to Florida, started over, and on the 100th day of his journey, as he was walking the Florida Panhandle, barefoot, mind you, right? Walking barefoot across the country, if I hadn't mentioned it, right? That was his point, right? Barefoot across the country, was actually struck and killed by an SUV. So one of my chapters is about the challenge that he sort of gave voice to in all of his social media posts of creating a space of the road one day, of imagining and trying to kind of bring to life a space of the road that was actually safe for all living beings, right? Safe for all living beings, right? Imagining a future where one day any living being could walk down the middle of the road, human or non-human, and not have to worry about its safety, right? Mind you, right? One of the things that struck me most powerfully when I went and spent some time on this highway corridor in North Florida, where he was ultimately killed. And I went to that spot, and I was actually there on the first anniversary of his death in early 2018. Was just all the roadkill, all the carrion, all the dead animals, right? And this is something he thought a great deal about, right? Um, Putting your bare feet to the pavement is a radical form of vulnerability and exposure that is different from walking with shoes. There are everyday forms of protection that we take for granted all the time. You can see masks as part of a larger suite of everyday forms of protection that I would say acknowledge the vulnerability of our bodies, attest to the fact that we have needs that we can't simply meet with our biological toolkits, and that we have to somehow like make our peace with. I think that these other gestures that people are interested in, like the concrete border wall, like the SUV, like the armored and gated neighborhood, all of these things are actually like they're doing something different, which is refusing to acknowledge that vulnerability, or at least acknowledging it as so stark that that it demands a far more radical form of distance from each other, a far more radical form of separation. And ultimately, I think that politics of mask refusal wouldn't have the kind of coherence that it would if people weren't already protected from others in countless other ways, if people weren't already separated from each other in countless other ways, if other logics of a far more radical protection weren't already insinuated far more deeply into the texture of everyday American life. There were articles that circulated in our American media in the spring of 2020 about cars and SUVs even as the ultimate PPE, right? And I think unless we had those more radical forms of really walling ourselves off from each other, this politics of anti-masking in a country like the United States would be entirely implausible. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer, but that's what comes to mind.
I think you just nailed it. I think you just brought some of those key points into a really sharp and clear-eyed point. I've got one final follow-up if no one else has a question. Do you want to go, Sophie? I see you gesturing towards the screen.
Rachel had.
Oh, Rachel. Okay, Rachel, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm trying to formulate my question here. I suppose one part of my question is what you're moving towards now. I mean, is it exposing those lines of connection where there is an insistence upon disconnection? I think that's one question. I suppose going along with that, maybe to circle back to the object analysis point that Eben raised earlier, and also Frederic, some of the objects that you're analyzing are they're right there in our pandemic now, and then there are other things that are these wonderful sort of like you turning it over in your hand, so to speak, and they're objects that were surprising in wonderful ways. And you know, as somebody who studies waste, and particularly in this moment in the EU, and observing everything that's going on and all of the tensions and all of the conversations and all of the sanctions and all of the sort of escalation, de-escalation, and these sort of backs and forths, I mean, I can't help but be struck by some of these objects that you're closely analyzing, and just wondering where did the spark come from with some of these objects that you do piece together, and what do you think of them now in this moment where, I mean, you know, we just watched a couple of nights, I mean, I just listened into a press conference with the Atomic Energy Agency about, you know, warfare against radioactive or atomic energy, nuclear energy site and radioactive waste nearby, and in other words, exposing, you know, these sort of political attempts to kind of expose the fact that we can no longer ignore or insist upon the disconnections. I can't help but think of people, you know, driving these large SUVs that they insist upon, say in the United States context, as if it isn't connected to, say, energy lines and the conversations that are happening now. So
I was what I had in mind was a book about plastic. I had grants that whole year off. But what I began to notice in the fall of 2016 was this really strange parallel between the discourses in the world of plastic production and consumption that I was noticing and picking up and beginning to kind of piece together, and what I was hearing about the border. Because I was struck by the extent to which so many of the disposable plastic objects that I'd begun to kind of track and like look at the cultural life of were predicated on the necessity to seal and contain, and in particular to manage the movement of things that were fluid and had to somehow be sealed off. And of course, you know, you have the plastic bottle, right, as in some ways the kind of paradigmatic embodiment of that. And at the same time, this presidential candidate was using a relentlessly aqueous imagination to talk about migrants. If you go back and look at his tweets around why border security is so important, the language is incredibly aqueous. It's always about floods, about things seeping, pouring, and then this notion then of an impervious barrier, immune to that kind of movement. And Coulter even said that you know, when the bathtub is overflowing, you turn the tap off as a way of making sense of this. So this way in which humans in need were figured so easily in terms of a non-human flow that needed to be contained, and the logic of these things that justify themselves in terms of their power to contain, that was actually what kicked me off on this to begin with. That's how it got here. That's where it all began. And yeah, so you're right to point that out, and that in some ways has to do with the architecture of the larger manuscript, because I think that like what I began to see, like when I saw that parallel, I began to see how containment was a kind of everyday obsession in a variety of ways, and then the book became an effort to try to log that and to think about the resonances and echoes between different fields and sites and forms of containment.
Thanks so much, Anand. We are right at the witching hour. It's been a real pleasure to engage with this really clear-eyed and sharp analysis again.
There was one more question, Evan. Do you want to?
Oh, there is. I didn't see it. For some reason, I'm not seeing the hands today. Anyway, go ahead.
You want to ask a question? So, I thought.
Okay. Do you want to ask a question?
No, I'm using my phone and try to just send clapping emoji.
Okay. Okay, right. Yeah, so apologies if I missed your hand today. All right, I see the clap, virtual clap. So thanks again, Anand. Next week we've got Jeremy Barr, who's a phage virologist, talking about the way that phage is being used to sort of deal with antimicrobial resistance, as well as the broader questions of ecology and the microbiome. Thanks again for these, amazingly insightful essays into the contemporary US scene, Anand, and hope to see you again in a Zoom room or maybe in the real world sometime soon.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. No, thank you so much. These are brilliant questions, and they're already changing the way that I imagine all this writing. So I really appreciate this chance for a conversation. Thanks you all for joining in, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.